Nick, let's talk about how to book Air Canada Aeroplan Stopover Awards. Now, I know that you can, with Air Canada Aeroplan, you can add 5,000 points to an award booking in order to add a stopover, but I have no idea how to do that. So I'm looking forward to you showing me how. How does this work?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great feature of the Air Canada Aeroplan program because, like Greg said, for 5,000 additional points per passenger per direction, you can add a stopover in each direction on your outbound and on your return. If you're booking a round trip or if you're booking a one way, you just add a stopover for 5,000 points. So, first, we should define the difference between a layover and a stopover. So, a stopover is when you have a connection that lasts for more than 24 hours. So, you stop in an airport between your origin and your destination and you stay there in that city for more than 24 hours. If it's less than 24 hours, it's just a layover and you're allowed, I'm going to use the word unlimited, and that's somewhat misleading, but an unlimited number of layovers that are less than 24 hours. I say it's somewhat misleading because Air Canada will only allow a maximum of 6 segments in each direction, but after each segment, you could have a connection that lasts anything up to 24 hours, and that's not considered a stopover. With Air Canada Aeroplan, a stopover can be from 24 hours up to 45 days. So you can stop over somewhere for up to 45 days. They do not allow a stopover in the United States or Canada. So you cannot do a stopover in the US or Canada, but you can do a stopover anywhere else along the way. So that can be a really valuable thing because it can give you the opportunity to see two different cities and save you some money. So I'm going to show an example that gives you the basic gist of how you can do this because some stopovers can be booked online. What we'll call relatively simple stopovers, probably their intended use of a stopover, is pretty easy to book for yourself online. And then I'll show you a more complicated way of going about it to put together some of the more complex itineraries that you might have seen bloggers like us write about. Okay, so you're going to start out at aircanada.com to look for a simple stopover. The first thing you need to do is check the box that says book with Aeroplan points. That tells it that you want to search for an award ticket rather than for a paid cash revenue fare. Then out of this drop-down box here, instead of round trip or one way, you want to pick multi-city. And when you have the Aeroplan points box checked, you'll see it says multi-city/stopover. So let's say you want to go from Boston to Milan. We're going to pick an example date in January. Then there's this little link here that says add stopover for flight 1. That's where you want to put in the stopover information, not flight 2, which I know is a little counterintuitive. So you'll hit add stopover for flight 1 and tell it you want to stop over in a city. Let's say you'd like to visit Frankfurt for a couple of days and spend some time in Germany. So we'll put in Frankfurt as our stopover city, and the length of the stopover, well, figure out how many days you want to stay. Let's say you want to spend a week in Frankfurt on your way to Milan. So you'll pick out the length of time. So again, the city you'd like to stop over in and the length of time that you'd like to stop over there for. So that's actually going to show us 2 flights, even though I know it says flight number 2 here. Like I said, I find this part of the tool a little counterintuitive. You have to remove this second flight when you're looking at a simple stopover like this. Don't forget to hit remove. If I just hit search, it's going to tell me that I need to enter information here. What you might be tempted to do if you want to stop over in Frankfurt is fly or search Boston to Frankfurt on, let's say, January 15th, and then Frankfurt to Milan a week later. And this is how you would use a multi-city tool on a lot of other airline search tool programs, but it's not how it works with Air Canada Aeroplan, because if I search this way, it will let me search, but then it will add the pricing cumulatively instead of pricing
giving you a
it
5,000 point stopover.
stopover. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't want to search by putting in the flights separately. But instead, what we want to do again is remove flight 2. So now what it's going to look for is it's going to look to get us from Boston to Frankfurt, stop for 7 days, and then continue on to Milan. And we'll hit search and we'll see the results. Okay, once the search results come up, it always prompts you to sign in, but I don't worry about that. I just X out of that because you don't need to be signed in order to see availability. Although if you've got elite status with Aeroplan or the Aeroplan credit card, then you may want to sign in so that you might see access to expanded availability or different pricing. And the next thing I do, let's say I want to fly business class, is I click to sort this by the business class pricing. Now, I don't want it to sort from high price to low price because that's going to show me a bunch of non-saver awards. So I'll click it a couple of times if I have to until it's starting with a low number here. So you'll see we can fly from Boston to Frankfurt, stop in Frankfurt for a week, and then it continues on from Frankfurt to Milan. And if we expand the details here, we can see what we would be flying. We'd be flying Lufthansa from Boston to Frankfurt, and then flying Air Dolomiti, which is a Lufthansa subsidiary, I think, from Frankfurt to Milan. And so again, we'd have our week-long stopover, and it gives us other options and tells you the number of seats. It doesn't always tell you the number of seats. When there's only a few left, it'll tell you the number of seats. So this particular itinerary has 1 seat. This one has 2 seats, you see. And you could scroll through and decide which of these works best for your schedule. And so as I scroll through, I can see there's also options where from Frankfurt, instead of flying nonstop to Milan, we could fly via Zurich to Milan. Now, okay, I wanted to point this out. You'll see some results say mixed cabin. And when mixed cabin is in red, that means that less than 50% of the itinerary is going to be in that particular cabin. So when I see mixed cabin in the business class section in red, I tend to ignore those and scroll past them because I know that means less than half the itinerary is going to be in business class. And I don't really want to pay the business class price to fly less than half the itinerary in business class. In this case, when you mouse over it, it tells you it's only 7% in business class. So only one very short leg in this itinerary would be in business class. I'm not interested in that. So I tend to scroll past those. Now, when mixed cabin is in black, as you see here, that means more than 50% of the itinerary is in business class. Now I might be interested because if there's only a short leg in economy class, that might interest me. And look at this, 91% is in business class. So on this particular itinerary, it flies from Boston to Toronto to Frankfurt and then has the 7-day stopover and
Mhm.
continues from Frankfurt to Milan. I'm going to guess it's that Boston to
To Toronto.
Toronto leg. Yeah, so that's an economy. So if I click the price, it will show me when I scroll down, mixed cabin. Yep, Boston to Toronto is the leg in economy class. And so I may still pick that itinerary if it fit my needs. Otherwise, timing wise, for some reason, then I may decide that I want to do that because I might not mind flying that leg in economy class. So you see, there's
Yeah.
lots of different
Well,
options here. Go ahead. Yes. Question.
yeah, there are. So the one you showed it near the top of
Mhm.
going from Frankfurt to, I think it was Zurich on to
Mhm.
Milan. Could I add another stopover in Zurich if I want to?
Good question. You can't add another stopover, but you could potentially search to add a longer layover. So the one you were asking about here, I'll just do a control F for ZRH to find. There we go. This is the one you were talking about right here. So this, you see, has a layover of 1 hour and 45 minutes in Zurich. And so I couldn't add another stopover because you can only have one stopover per direction. And we've got our 7-day stopover in Frankfurt already. But maybe you want to go to Zurich and spend a little bit of time in Zurich. That's fine. We could potentially fly to Zurich and have a layover of up to 24 hours and then continue on from there to Milan. Now, that might not show up in the search results here. That's going to be a more complex routing, and I'll talk about a specific example of a more complex routing in a second. And you'll have to call when you want to put together something a little more complicated that doesn't show up in the search tool. But just knowing that Zurich is a hub for Swiss, I would be willing to bet that you probably have a number of options to get to Milan from Zurich. So they're going to show you whatever the best one is here. But I bet you that there are ones with much longer layovers that just don't show up in the initial search results. So if you wanted almost a day in Zurich, I bet you could probably find a different flight from Zurich to Milan.
Okay,
And you
that
could
makes
probably
sense.
make that happen.
Another question is, you picked an example where you happen to have a word space right away.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that if you had put in that 7-day stopover, there wouldn't have been a word space on that second leg 7 days later. How would you? But there might have been for a 6-day stopover or for an 8-day stopover. How would you have figured that out? Would this help at all? If you've
Well,
put in 7 days, is there some way to see? Well, there's more options if you do a different length layover.
no, not really. I mean, you could put in 6 days and 8 days, and you could play with the tool by picking different numbers of days. And then the other piece of it is going to be kind of the human element of thinking about it. So let's say that I didn't find anything here, right? So that's a good example that Craig's giving. Let's say on that 7-day stopover, I didn't find any way to Milan. Well, then I might say, okay, you know what? Let me just see if I start in Frankfurt, what my options are for getting to Milan. So I'm going to fly Boston to Frankfurt. I'm going to get there at 5:25 in the morning on January 16th. So anything leaving later than that with enough time to, of course, connect should potentially work. So what I would do personally is I would just start doing a search from Frankfurt to Milan. And again, I knew that the initial flight was landing on January 16th. And so maybe I'll pick a different day here. So the 7-day stopover was continuing around the 23rd, probably. Let's say the 20th. I want to continue on. So I might search and see, well, what options are there to get to Milan from Frankfurt on January 20th? And I bet there'll be a bunch of different options. And so then it would be a matter of going back to the initial search tool and entering a different length of stopover. Or if it's not showing up via the search tool, then it'll be a matter of calling and telling them, okay, I want that Boston to Frankfurt flight, and then walking the agent through the next set of flights that you want. Maybe you have this Frankfurt to Zurich to Milan flight that you want here, and that is a kind of an interesting one because it adds in Ethiopian Airlines, which is one you probably wouldn't have thought to fly from Zurich to Milan, but it shows that there are lots of different options out there. And this tool will show this, but maybe the stopover tool won't. And so that's where my second more complex example is going to come in terms of trip planning. So, if you see the thing you want in the first search result because you just want that simple nonstop Boston to Frankfurt and then the simple nonstop Frankfurt to Milan, well, you're good to go with the stopover tool. Okay, let's take a look at a slightly more complex example. So let's say that what you really want to do is create a complex routing where you get a bunch of chances to have long layovers, because Air Canada Aeroplan has 40-something airline partners, the most airline partnerships of any program out there, and they have really flexible routing rules. And so the key element of the routing rules is that you can't fly more than double the distance from your starting point to your ending point. You can zigzag a little bit, that's fine, as long as the total distance flown is not more than double the straight line distance from your starting point to your ending point. So let's say you wanted to start in Boston that same day, but instead of flying to Frankfurt, maybe you'd like to see Zurich on your way eastward. So we're going to start with a flight from Boston to Zurich on January 15th. And so, again, make sure that you have your box checked. And in this case, what I'm going to do now is show how to mix different partners and try to maximize layovers to get almost 24 hours in a number of different cities on a single one-way award. And so when you book this type of itinerary, you're going to have to call in order to book it over the phone. So we're not going to use the stopover tool because that's not going to be useful on these much more complex routings. The stopover tool only works on an itinerary with up to 4 segments. And even then, I find it really struggles with anything that's more than 3 segments. It just won't show you all of the available options. And that's because it takes a while for the computers to look up all this availability. And obviously, as a customer, you want search results quickly. So they show you the simple search results at first. But let's take a look at Boston to Zurich, because we say, all right, let's start out going to Zurich for a day. And so I'll look up and see what options there are from Boston to Zurich. All right, again, I just exit out of the prompt to log in. And you'll see right at the top, there's a nonstop Boston to Zurich on Swiss. I can, again, sort these by business class, and I'll see that there are some other options to get to Zurich, too. I could connect through Frankfurt. We knew that there was a flight through Frankfurt from our search results a little while ago. But right away, we have a nonstop to Zurich. And so if I really wanted to spend a day or so in Zurich, then what I would do here is I would write down this flight information. So I don't really care when it leaves Boston because that's my origin point, but it's going to arrive in Zurich at 11:10 a.m. the day after I leave. It's an overnight flight. So I'm going to arrive in Zurich at 11:10 a.m. on January 16th. Then what I'll do is I'll hit details so I can get the flight number. This is LX53. And I'll write that down along with the date that I'm leaving and the time, because when I call and speak to an agent, it's going to be helpful if I can tell them, okay, I want to depart Boston on January 15th. On flight LX53, and then they'll probably confirm the times. Okay, so I'll write that information down. All right, so this first leg is going to land in Zurich at 11:10 a.m. on January 16th. So my next leg of the trip has to depart Zurich before 11:10 a.m. the next day, because you can stay up to 24 hours without paying for a stopover. And let's say that I don't want to pay for a stopover just yet. I want to stop over in a different place along the route.
Okay.
So
So you're
let's say,
arriving Thursday
yes.
morning. You want to
Yep.
stay until Friday morning, but you have to leave earlier than 11:10 a.m. is what you're saying.
Earlier than 10 a.m. on Friday. Exactly. And for the purposes of this example, let's say that ultimately I want to end up in Bangkok. So I want to get to Bangkok, but I don't necessarily need a straight line to Bangkok.
Okay.
So let's say I want to stop somewhere in the Middle East along the way. So the 16th, again, we're arriving at 11:10 a.m. And I want to see if I can get myself a full day in Istanbul. So, or rather, I'm sorry, not in Istanbul, rather, a full day in Zurich. So I'm going to search next from Zurich. I said Istanbul because I was looking at my notes, because
Mhm.
Istanbul would be a good place to spend a day.
Sure.
So on the 17th now, I'm going to search to Istanbul and see if we can depart for Istanbul before 11:10 a.m. So I'll get my full almost 24 hours in Zurich and then continue on to Istanbul. Now, remember, the first flight was flying Swiss from Boston to Zurich. And then we could leave on Friday morning as early as 6:45 a.m. and fly to Istanbul. Okay, so if we sort by earliest departure time so that we can see the earliest options for leaving Zurich the next morning. So there's a nonstop from Zurich to Istanbul, leaves at 6:45 in the morning, gets to Istanbul at 11:45 the next, or rather that same day. So this is on the 17th now. We're on the 17th, arriving in Istanbul at 11:45 a.m. So we spent most of at least an afternoon and evening in Zurich, got up the next morning, flew to Istanbul, and now we can spend some time in Istanbul. So we have up until 11:45 the next day if we don't want to use our stopover yet on Istanbul. And I don't want to use the stopover just yet if we can avoid it. So now we're going to be arriving at 11:45 a.m. on Friday, January 17th in Istanbul. And so let's say that we want to continue on from Istanbul, and our next stop on our way to Bangkok is going to be, let's say we want to go to Abu Dhabi. All right. So remember, we were arriving in Istanbul at 11:45 a.m. on January 17th. So I'm going to sort these by earliest departure time, but I actually really want to look at the latest departure times to see how late we could depart to get to Abu Dhabi for our next stop. And it
So you
doesn't
don't want to
really.
spend the night in Istanbul, looks like.
Well,
Is that
I'll
what's
try
happening?
that. I'll try that in a second also. I want to get
I
a
see.
full sense of my options here. So
Gotcha.
there's nothing that's leaving late enough to get to Abu Dhabi. There's a 7:45 p.m. to Abu Dhabi. That doesn't give me as much time as I'd like in Istanbul. So yeah, I'm going to try the next morning now. So again, we're arriving at 11:45 on the 17th. So now I'm going to sort by earliest departure time and see, okay, if I do spend the night in Istanbul, when is the earliest that I could leave to continue on to Abu Dhabi next? And there are some connecting itineraries here, but I'm going to continue through and see if I can find a non-stop to Abu Dhabi. And look at that. There's one on Etihad that leaves at 7:35 in the morning. So this would give me, again, almost 24 hours, not quite, but almost 24 hours in Istanbul. So we'll have spent almost 24 hours in Zurich, almost 24 hours in Istanbul. That would continue on to Abu Dhabi and get to Abu Dhabi at 1:05 in the afternoon. Okay, so now again, I'd expand details. I would write down flight numbers and times and dates so that I can feed all that information to the Air Canada Aeroplan agent. When I call to make this kind of a booking, I explain that I'm looking to make a complicated one-way booking with a bunch of flights and different partners. And usually what they will do is listen and hear me out, and I'll give them all of the dates and flight numbers and departure times right from the beginning of the call. They'll write it all down, and then they put it all into the computer and price it out. It's a really easy process if you're prepared when you make the phone call. All right, so this gets to Abu Dhabi at 1:05 p.m. on Saturday, January 18th. So, okay, let's say that now we want to fly from Abu Dhabi. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Abu Dhabi. Maybe we want to try to get most of a day in Abu Dhabi. Okay, we'll see if we can get another 24-hour-ish layover and continue on to Muscat because we have some more time on our hands. We
Because
don't
why
need to get
not?
to Bangkok. Why not? As one does. So we'll have had almost 24 hours in Zurich, almost 24 hours in Istanbul. Let's see if we can get close to 24 hours in Abu Dhabi before we continue on to Muscat. So again, Abu Dhabi, we would have landed on the 18th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, if I remember correctly, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we would need to continue on from Abu Dhabi to Muscat sometime earlier than that. And oh, look, there's a 9:25 a.m. Now, this is only available in economy class. It's a relatively short flight, though, at just an hour and 10 minutes.
Hmm.
So I think that might be okay. That would be
Sure.
okay for me anyway, for the 1 hour long flight. So here we go. I would write down the information, say, okay, we're going to fly to Muscat now on January 19th. So again, almost 24 hours in Abu Dhabi, plenty of time to catch the sunset at the Grand Mosque or head over to Ferrari World for the afternoon or something like that, and then continue on to Muscat. And so we would be getting to Oman at 10:35 in the morning on January 19th. And so let's say we're going to spend a few days in Muscat. So now after we've written down that information, we can search for our next piece here and tell the Aeroplan agent when we call, okay, I'd like to spend a few days in Muscat. I'm getting there on January 19th. I'm going to continue on to Bangkok. Let's say we'll spend a week and a half there and continue on January 29th to Bangkok because you can have a stopover of as long as you want, right? Up to 45 days. So I picked a random day here to start out with, and maybe we'll find availability on the 29th. Maybe not. We can always adjust. So this goes to what Greg was talking about before. Can we adjust segments? Can we adjust times? And so that's going to be a matter of your search results. But we'll see here after a stopover of several days in Muscat, we could fly nonstop to Bangkok. We've got a couple of different options here to fly nonstop to Bangkok on this day. And again, I would expand the details, write down the information, and then be able to feed that to the Aeroplan agent.
Yeah.
Now, that so far is Boston to Zurich. Then we had the almost 24 hours in Zurich, then Zurich to Istanbul, and almost 24 hours in Istanbul, Istanbul to Abu Dhabi, almost 24 hours in Abu Dhabi, Abu Dhabi to Muscat, and then we did our stopover, and then continued on from Muscat to Bangkok. That's 5 segments. That's 5 flights. Aeroplan will actually allow 6 segments on a one-way award. So we don't necessarily have to stop in Bangkok either. We could spend another 24 hours-ish in Bangkok and continue on from there because let's say we're going to land at 6:45 a.m. We'll take this flight from Muscat that lands in Bangkok at 6:45 a.m. on January 29th. And maybe we'll say, you know what, I'd like to get to Bangkok. I'd like to get something delicious to eat. But you know what, maybe instead, let's go to Bali. So that one arrives again on January 30th. So I've got all of January 30th to find a flight to get to Bali, one more segment. So I'd have to see if there's a nonstop from Bangkok to Bali because I can only add one more segment on this trip and it has to be a stop of less than 24 hours. And looks like I would have a couple of options here anyway to get to Bali nonstop. Now, this would be not a very long layover in Bangkok, not enough time to do much. Neither of these really would give me a whole bunch of time. So maybe I'd have to adjust a day or two forward or backward if I wanted to do that. Now, if you ask, okay, well, is that all illegal routing? Can I do that? Let's pretend you are going to stay in Bangkok to keep this a little bit simpler. So Boston to Bangkok, the total distance, I'll use a tool called Great Circle Mapper, gcmap.com. And so if I look up the distance from Boston to Bangkok, the distance of a nonstop flight there would be 8,539 miles.
Hmm.
So my total itinerary can't be more than double that. So we were talking about flying Boston to Zurich to Istanbul to Abu Dhabi to Muscat to Bangkok. And so my total distance can't be more than double this, so roughly 17,000 miles. And
Hmm.
sure enough, the total distance here is a little bit less than 10,000 miles. That'd be a totally legal routing. So that's an example of how you would figure out that your routing does work. It's less than double the distance, so it should work there. And sometimes I'll search with a couple of different windows open so I can find different options when I'm considering things. Maybe you look at that Muscat to Bangkok and you say, oh, well, there's some options that connect in Kuala Lumpur. Maybe I could stay in Kuala Lumpur for almost 24 hours before continuing on. Depends on your tolerance for, of course, those 24-hour stops. But when they are pretty close to 24 hours, it can kind of help you adjust to the time zone differences as you fly around. And this is part of the fun of Air Canada Aeroplan because an award from North America to the Pacific Zone, which is where Bangkok would be, at most, at the longest distance, which is going to be the distance band we're in here, it's going to be 115,000 miles one way in business class. And if you add a stopover, like we did in our example here, it'll be an additional 5,000. So 120,000 miles to end up stopping in a number of different cities. This is what you've got to do if you want to book one of these complicated stopovers, though. You're going to have to hunt and pack a little bit and search out your individual segments, write down the information, and then call Air Canada Aeroplan in order to book over the phone.
That is so cool. Can you hit that map button so we can see what it looks like drawn out?
Yeah. So here you have the map from Boston to Zurich to Istanbul to Abu Dhabi to Muscat to Bangkok. And I looked up originally some other options too that added a connection in Bahrain. That would have been an option if we had searched slightly differently on some of the segments there. And so that would have added a little bit of distance, but again, not enough that it would have been out of the distance band. So rather than a simple one connection to get to Bangkok, you could add yourself an opportunity to see a whole bunch of different cities. This is one of the things that is well loved about Air Canada Aeroplan. Obviously, an itinerary like this won't appeal to everyone, but for folks that do want to try to see a bunch of different things on a single one way, that's an option. Now, if you go back to all those search results that I showed, then you'll find that there were actually lots of other options too. We could have flown from Zurich to Cairo to Istanbul, and I looked up an example there that would have given enough time to see the pyramids in Cairo before continuing on to Istanbul. Because Air Canada has so many partners, you have a lot of different options. So I showed some kind of preset examples here, but you can get as complicated as you want. Again, up to 6 segments in one direction. So not more than 6 flights in one direction and only one stopover of more than 24 hours.
That's really cool. And just, I guess, one little warning. At one point, we saw a result. I think it might have been from Muscat to Bangkok or somewhere that had first class available. And just a warning that if you pick first class for that one single leg, it's going to reprice the entire award as if the whole thing is first class. So you don't want to do first class for that leg. I wouldn't think.
Well, right. That's a very good point. You're going to pay the price based on the highest cabin you travel in. So exactly one segment will bump you into the price for that class of service for the entire itinerary. And with first class, there are only so many airlines that fly first class. Now, Air Canada has a totally separate award chart for Emirates. So if you look up an itinerary that includes one leg on Emirates, it's going to price the entire itinerary as though it's an Emirates itinerary, and that's going to be a much higher price than with all of their other partners. So whether that single segment is in economy or business or first class, you generally probably want to avoid mixing Emirates with other partners unless the majority of your itinerary is in Emirates and you're okay with the higher pricing. But in terms of first class, your options for flying first class are somewhat limited because there aren't very many airlines that still fly a first class cabin. Lufthansa does, Oman Air does, and that's why you would have seen that first class result between Muscat and Bangkok. And ANA does, but there aren't a ton of options for flying ANA first class. And I don't believe you can book Singapore Airlines first class through Air Canada Aeroplan. So I think that's basically going to be the extent of your first class options. So if you do want to fly first class, you have to consider, okay, how many legs of this itinerary can be in first? And then maybe it makes more sense to book a business class itinerary to get to Muscat and book that leg perhaps separately from Muscat to Bangkok in first class. You'll have to do the math and run the numbers in terms of what works out to be a more affordable journey.
Yeah. All right. This is awesome. One last question for you, Nick. Can you have a open jaw? So could I fly into Frankfurt, take a train to, let's say, Italy, and fly from, I don't know, Venice to somewhere else as part of this?
No, they don't allow an open jaw. So, you know what? I take that back. You can't have an open jaw at your stopover point, and I don't think, practically speaking, that there's another open jaw that'll be allowed. So, you can do an open jaw in terms of if you were flying to Europe one way to one city, you could fly back from a different city in the other direction. But in a single direction, no, you're not going to be able to do an open jaw on a complex single direction itinerary.
That's what I needed to know. Thanks, Nick.
You're welcome.